Wherever you are around the world, welcome to Unheard Stories. I am Lubna Hassania, and I'm joining you from beautiful Southern California. My guest today is Dr. Mohamad Koubeissi. He will be sharing with us his remarkable journey into the world of the human brain. I would like to first welcome the dignitaries on the call. We have Councillor Mirna Khawli, former Consul General of Lebanon to LA, Councillor Ghassan Abdel Khaliq, former Chargé d'Affaires of Lebanon to India, Honorary Consul of Lebanon for the Greater Cleveland area, Mr. Anthony Asher, and Honorary Consul of the Republic of Senegal to Los Angeles, Mame Toucouleur Mbaye. We also have Princess Hayat Arslan and the Honorable Judge Tony Raphael. Thank you all for honoring us with your presence, and welcome everyone. The brain weighs 3 pounds. It contains 86 billion neurons, which are the cells that make up the brain, and 100 trillion connections with branching network that looks no different from the markings on the surface of Mars or the network of mycelia, the roots of mushrooms. The human brain is one of the greatest mysteries in life. Neurology is still in its infancy, challenged not only by the staggering anatomy of the brain, but also by the complexity of the neurological and psychiatric disorders, from Alzheimer's to epilepsy and schizophrenia, from autism to depression and anxiety. To give us a better understanding of the human brain, we have with us today Dr. Mohamad Koubeissi, Professor of Neurology and Director of the Epilepsy Center at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Koubeissi earned his MD from the American University of Beirut, the AUB. He pursued his clinical training in medicine and neurology at Upstate Medical University in Syracuse and at NYU in New York, and in epilepsy at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He was on faculty at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio for 6 years before he joined George Washington University in 2012. Ever since his training, Dr. Koubeissi has started new lines of research projects in epilepsy. He has lectured on the medical and surgical treatment of intractable epilepsy all over the US, as well as in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. He's well published and well cited in the field of epilepsy and is a reviewer for a number of major journals. Dr. Koubeissi directs the annual Epilepsy Board Review course and the world-renowned
live streaming monthly epilepsy grand rounds at George Washington University. Among his awards, he is a fellow at the American Academy of Neurology, at the American Neurological Association, and at the American Epilepsy Society, and has earned numerous other honors, including the Innovation Award from the School of Engineering at Case Western in 2012. He's a member of the Golden Key International Honor Society. Dr. Koubeisi's research on consciousness and epilepsy was featured in a National Geographic documentary that aired in November 2015 all over the world in more than 50 languages. Now, without further ado, let's meet our guest. Dr. Koubeissi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Lubna. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you for everybody who's attending. I'm delighted and honored to be here.
Ahla wa sahla. Well, Dr. Koubeissi, from the second I looked up your work, I realized the amazing conversation you and I can have on Unheard Stories. What I did not expect is that you and I were not only brought up in Beirut, but we literally map onto the same neighborhood. You and I walked the same streets growing up. We shopped from the same neighborhood stores. We lived through same good times and bad. We experienced Beirut's distinctive ethos and love of life. But we also lived through the trauma of war. Dr. Koubeissi, how did Beirut shape the person you grew up to be?
Well, the proximity of death and trauma, probably as traumatic as it is, it can make you value time. You want to milk the minutes and do whatever it takes to accomplish things that are difficult to accomplish in a country in war. So I devoted all my time to reading and poetry and literature and science and mathematics and whatever I could get to do. I wanted to play soccer all the time, but I couldn't, obviously, because there were like exacerbations of war every now and then. So yeah, I mean, maybe we inherited some trauma from the war, but we also inherited appreciation of the importance of time.
And the resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Koubeissi, when did you become more interested and intrigued by the works of the human brain? Was it during your medical school or was it prior to that?
It was actually prior, which prompted me to apply to medical school. So in high school, I was not interested in biology at all. I had a very wrong idea about what biology was, and the mere fact that you had to read a text and memorize it and then rewrite it in exams was very boring to me. So I went to the towards mathematics, and when I applied to college, I applied for a math major, which is what I did at AUB initially. I was so fascinated by mathematics, so fond of math. And I wanted to be a pure mathematician, not even applied mathematics, Throughout my years in college, it became evident that I couldn't pursue math in Lebanon. There is no PhD that was, available at my school. And it was tough for me to travel to the United States or, to any other country to pursue the PhD. And I remember a friend of mine took a course in biology, and he and I were very close friends, and he convinced me to take the course with him. It was animal physiology sort of course. And I remember there were like 2 chapters in that course, one on the nervous system and one on the endocrine system. The one on the endocrine system explained how, when birds sing, their singing triggers hormones in other birds that in turn influence the behavior of nesting or mating. And then, the chapter on the nervous system also mentioned some experiments where if you electrically stimulate a specific area in the cat brain, you can induce rage and so forth. And I was like, I've been fascinated by psychology, by poetry, by math, by everything that the human brain does, but I didn't understand the biological underpinnings of this. So this was the moment I started to think about pursuing medicine. I didn't know initially, when I applied to medical school, I didn't know whether I wanted to be a psychiatrist or a neurologist. But in second year medical school, I knew without any hesitation that I wanted to become not just a neurologist, but an epileptologist.
Okay.
And it was because we studied how, the mapping of the human brain in that course, how there's something called functional localization of brain function, which is an area that continues to be challenged now, but there are areas of the brain that are important for language or memory or vision or, other things. And that was to me totally fascinating. And the rest is history.
Can you walk us a little bit through the anatomy of the brain, from the hindbrain to the neocortex? In what order do they develop in our body? And what does each one of them do? What is it responsible for?
So I mean, if you look at the brain stem, you will find a lot of areas that are responsible for regulating breathing, automatic breathing, regulating heart rate, and monitoring the internal environment, the visceral environment, maintaining blood pressure, and so forth. You will also find areas important for balance or hearing. Even vision, obviously, is processed at the level of the brain stem, as well as the cerebral cortex eventually. But everything that we feel and every movement that we do, whether it's a facial movement or a body movement, has to go through the brain stem in either what we call the pyramidal tracts, which is important for movement. That comes, the orders come from the cortex through the brain stem, or the ascending ones that bring all the sensation from the face and from the body, from everywhere, through the brainstem to an area that is at the center of the brain called the thalamus, which in turn projects its fibers to the cortex for processing and for perception of everything. So obviously the human brain is famous for, unique for its for the cortical development, which is different from other species.
Okay.
The cortex in humans has 6 different layers, and the amount of computations that the cerebral cortex can do and the amount of connectivity that exists between different areas of the cerebral cortex on both sides of the brain is definitely unique, and and underlies the uniqueness of human aptitudes, including dexterity of the hand, imagination, memory, and abstract thinking, and language, and other things. There are areas in the brain as well that are not on the cortex. Well, they are cortical areas, but they appear to be embedded like within the cortex, and these are the insulae. Insulae is the plural, the singular is insula. We have 1 insula on each side of the brain, which is a structure that I'm very, very interested in. And, one may hypothesize that there are areas within the insula that make us unique. I mean, that makes humans uniquely who they are in terms of associating perceptions of the world and of the internal environment with affect and also with behavior. And we can talk about this probably more.
And other animals and other species do not have the insula?
They do, but there is an area of the insula which is called the anterior dorsal insula, which is much more developed in humans than other species. And there's a kind of neurons in the insula called von Economy neurons, and these are believed to associate the perception with action, with behavior, and with affect, which is the function that I mentioned. So von Economy neurons are do not exist in the macaque monkey. They are very scarce in the chimpanzee, and they are abundant in humans. So it is easy to make the scientists speculate or hypothesize that that they have a function that is uniquely human. Interestingly, their number is less in children than it is in adults. So they increase over time. Which is probably in parallel to experience and to associations and to training, and to everything that determines at any point how we react in response to a stimulus.
What is the range in size do you see among human beings? Is there a big range? Do people have slightly smaller brains than others?
Among, intellectually normal, healthy humans, the differences are minimal, even if there is like a difference in weight, but it probably does not reflect difference in the number of neurons. Obviously, the older people get, the more atrophic the brain will become, especially in the presence of certain risk factors, such as, any risk factors that increase the chances of vascular disease. Yes. Including, hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, smoking, and other heavy drinking. There are many things that can lead to atrophy of the brain. But in general, if you're talking about a middle-aged, healthy individual, the brains are very comparable. Obviously, there are pathologic conditions when the brain is much smaller, microcephaly and others, but that's a pathology that is due to specific etiologies.
Okay. And throughout millennia, the way the brain changed with the Homo sapiens is it got bigger, right?
The cortex got bigger. So if you look at the cortex and all the what we call the gyri and sulci, the gyrus is the protuberance and the sulcus is the like a groove in between two protuberances. So if you spread the brain flat, the total surface area of expanded over time. Yes, but our species has not changed really much for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Really, it hasn't changed much anatomically, which is fascinating. This issue was handled, very well by a writer named Merlin Donald from Case Western, who wrote about the 3 stages of evolution of the human brain. The fact that the same brain existed since antiquity, invites the elaboration and the hypotheses about what became different over time that makes today's humans different from the hunter-gatherer and so forth. So he suggests, stages of evolution that have led to how we are today.
Does it mean maybe we can build on the awareness of those who came before us?
This is exactly the key. This is exactly the key. So
if when we can record it, then we can keep track of it. And now we can do that. Yes.
And this is also uniquely human. Like if you look at certain species who are very, very intelligent, like the crow or the octopus or the chimpanzees or other species, they can use, like for example, the crows can use tools and think of multi-step procedures to solve problems and get food. Chimpanzees also use tools. They can use rocks to break the nuts, and they can teach their offspring to do the same and so forth. But if you look at several generations, you won't see any novel tools, any novelties or any innovative procedures that reflect, creativity and intelligence. It's very plateaued at a small level, whereas in humans, we are capable of metabolizing everything that our ancestors did and building on it.
That's amazing. And it's not inherited, right? Is it inherited or is it learned?
Knowledge itself?
What we build upon, that awareness.
Well, there is knowledge that we inherit. There is knowledge that we inherit. Whether we inherit other instinctual aptitudes like awareness or whether part of the knowledge is also inherited is controversial. Conceptual knowledge is inherited as is and is learned. But what the innate brain capacity is limited to is a matter of discussion.
Okay. Can you define epilepsy for us and talk a little bit about the cause or the many causes that could lead to epilepsy?
Epilepsy is a disease that is, or it's actually multiple diseases. Epilepsy is a condition that refers to the propensity to have recurrent unprovoked seizures. So this is the clinical, there is a conceptual definition and a clinical definition of epilepsy, but basically if somebody takes a specific medicine that can cause seizures and they have a seizure or two, that does not constitute epilepsy because it's a provoked seizure. If somebody has a head trauma and has a seizure immediately, that's a provoked seizure. If somebody is an alcoholic, which is an example that we see a lot in our emergency rooms, and they abstain suddenly from alcohol after heavy use for years, they can have an alcohol withdrawal seizure, which is also considered provoked. So seizures of that sort do not contribute to the definition of epilepsy. Definition of epilepsy is met after 2 or more unprovoked seizures occur, which tells you that this particular individual has either a genetic propensity or an acquired condition that makes their brain prone to fire seizures every now and then. So what is a seizure? A seizure generally is classified to either generalized or focal. The generalized seizures occur with a seizure discharge sort of almost simultaneously happening on both sides of the brain. If you put the electroencephalogram wires on the scalp and you record, from the onset of the seizure, it appears to be on both sides, whereas a focal seizure appears to start in a specific brain area before spreading to various degrees, either within the same hemisphere or even to the contralateral side. So whether focal or generalized, the definition of a seizure is that an abnormal electric discharge of the brain that leads to synchronous firing of neurons in focal area or in broad areas. And this synchronous firing of the neurons results in specific symptoms. If it affects broad areas of the brain, it can lead to alteration of consciousness. If it's limited to the area, let's say in the occipital lobe, which is in the back of the brain, then which is the area responsible for vision, then one may see flashes of light. If the seizure occurs in the area of the brain that is responsible for hearing, then one may experience like an auditory experience, and if it occurs in areas that are important for memory, then one may lose memory, will have amnesia for the event, and so forth. So it will alter the function of the areas of the brain that it involves, and it keeps recurring. And approximately, if you look at all individuals who have epilepsy, 2/3 of them can be controlled fully with medications, but there is a remaining third that will continue to be medically intractable and require other types of interventions.
And how many people, I mean, what is the percentage of people who end up with epilepsy?
So statistics, our epidemiologic studies have shown that maybe 1 in 10 individuals in the 1 in 10, so 10% will have a seizure at some point in their lives. But epilepsy itself, as defined the way I just did, which is recurrent unprovoked seizures, or the propensity to have recurrent seizures, occurs in 1% of the population. It is estimated that there are 3.4 million individuals in the United States who have epilepsy. And among these individuals, there is approximately 900,000 to 1 million who continue to have seizures despite treatment.
Wow. And when you talked about localized versus generalized, is the localized less intense usually?
In general, if you assess the response to medications, you will notice that probably the generalized ones, which are genetic, they tend to be, in general, more responsive to medications than the focal ones.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But on the other hand, the focal ones may be amenable to surgical treatment because there is a focus. And if you're capable of removing that focus surgically, a lot of these people will become seizure-free.
And is seizure only limited to the cortex, or does it happen in the deeper tissue?
We believe that the networks that cause, that are involved in seizures do definitely include thalamic and brainstem structures within the same seizure network. And there is a fascinating condition called hypothalamic hamartoma. It's an area in the hypothalamus that does not involve the cerebral cortex. It's very deep in what we call the diencephalon, the area that is underneath the thalamus in the center of the brain. And people who have hypothalamic hamartomas, they tend to present with seizures. And if the hypothalamic hamartoma is successfully operated on, then the seizures will stop, suggesting that seizures may originate outside of the cortex.
Okay.
What's interesting also about the hypothalamic hamartoma, since I'm mentioning it as an example, is that seizures almost always present with laughter. We call them gelastic seizures. So the onset of the seizure will involve laughter before the patient becomes unaware of what's going on around and becomes unresponsive.
Okay, that's actually my next question. Do we get a heads up with the seizure, or is the onset very quick?
Both situations happen. Many patients, especially with focal epilepsy, they will have what we call an aura, or a warning sign. And the warning sign or the aura is nothing but the seizure discharge itself being limited to a very small brain area that the patient experiences, but they are able to talk about it. They're able to tell you they're having it and so forth, because it's still, the seizure discharge itself has not involved large brain areas to cause unresponsiveness or unconsciousness or what have you. So, and then many people who have these auras will know that a bigger seizure is about to come in 10 seconds or 30 seconds or what have you. And so they assume a safe position so that when the seizure comes, they won't sustain injury.
Yes, yes. How do you treat epilepsy, Dr. Koubeissi? And are they completely treatable? You said some of them are not.
First thing, this is also, very important for people who are listening and for clinicians anywhere, is you need to confirm the diagnosis, obviously. And one may say, oh, of course, a seizure is a seizure, epilepsy is epilepsy, but you have no idea how many conditions tend to present as epilepsy and they're not epilepsy. About 1/3 of the patients that we monitor with continuous EEG in our hospital prove to have like emotional disturbance, really, something that we call psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. These are individuals, many of whom have sustained a trauma in the past, and they present with events that resemble epileptic seizures, sometimes with unconsciousness or with shaking. But these events are due to the trauma itself, or to PTSD, or just what we call psychosomatic or somatoform conditions. And this is very important because sometimes a patient gets sent to my clinic from a neurology clinic and for treatment of intractable epilepsy. And the patient has been receiving medications for seizures for 20 years. They even have implanted devices, electrical devices, to stimulate a nerve in the chest that has been shown to reduce seizures. And when you monitor them, you discover that they have psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. And then counseling them at that stage and discontinuing their medications and telling them to open a new chapter in their life becomes very difficult, because their whole life, socially and professionally, has become sort of like intertwined with that or dependent on that diagnosis. So this was a very long introduction to answer your question. The diagnosis of epilepsy is confirmed. Then what you do is you start with medications. You start with a single medication. About 50% of people will respond to that single initial medication and stop having seizures. Those who continue to have seizures on that medicine may require add-on medication. And with the second medication, another 15% or so of the patients become seizure-free. So far, with one or two medicine, you're capable of treating successfully approximately 2/3 of those who have epilepsy. And then we come to the remaining third, who will continue to have seizures despite 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 medications. And then they will need what we call surgical evaluation. What is a surgical evaluation? A surgical evaluation is a bunch of tests that help us identify the location of the seizure focus in the brain, and also help us identify the location of some important functions in the brain, such as language, for example, so that we know that the patient is a good candidate or not for surgery based on the proximity or lack thereof of the language areas, or what we call eloquent brain areas, areas of the brain that are important for certain functions, to the seizure focus. Okay, so to elaborate on this for a second, one of the things we do is to monitor the patient with continuous EEG and record their seizures, because when you see the initial seizure discharge, it tends to give you an idea about what part of the brain it's starting from. And then we do a brain MRI, which is a very important imaging study, because if there's a scar tissue or some lesion or an abnormal vessel or some old infection or something, then it gives you a great clue about where the seizures are coming from. We do something called functional MRI, which is a study that is done in the same MRI machine, but under different settings, where the patient is told to listen to stories or to produce words and so forth, which can help us localize the language, or at least what we call lateralize, tell if the language is mostly left or right. In the majority of people, it's left, obviously. So we do all these tests, and eventually we put all the data together and assess whether the patient is a good candidate for epilepsy surgery or not. And if they are, then we send them to the operating room with instructions to the surgeon how to, what to resect and whatnot.
Okay. Is there any link between a good, healthy ketogenic diet and a better improvement in seizure control?
Oh, definitely. The ketogenic diet is a very interesting treatment, because it's, I think it's been known to humans since antiquity, really. People, I think there are some maybe biblical stories or even pre-biblical stories about what fasting does in terms of seizures, like it helps seizures a lot. The ketogenic diet is interesting because individuals on the ketogenic diet don't eat any carbohydrates, any sugar, and so they form ketone bodies, alpha ketoglutarate and acetone and what have you, and the brain uses these for energy. Which tends to reduce seizures significantly. It is most commonly used in certain infantile epilepsies, in babies who have infantile spasms and difficult seizures, and it tends to be very helpful. It is much rarely used in adults because it's very difficult to adhere to and it's not palatable. So an alternative that has been studied in more than one study, more than one paper has been published, is the modified Atkins diet, which is relatively easier to adhere to, and it has been shown also to help seizures, to reduce seizures. However, we resort to the diets for treatment of seizures only after medications fail, and or maybe even after surgery fails, or after the patient proves not to be a good surgical candidate. So we leave it as a last resort, because the chances of the diet rendering someone completely seizure-free are not as good as that of medications or that of epilepsy surgery. Okay,
thank you for sharing all that. Now, individuals with epilepsy, Dr. Koubeissi, are found to be at a higher risk of having psychotic symptoms, like the ones that happen in schizophrenia. Van Gogh, one of the most influential figures in Western art history, had epilepsy and also suffered from psychosis. Is there any overlap between epilepsy and schizophrenia, whether the clinical or neuropathological overlap?
Yeah, this is again a very fascinating area of research and of clinical observation. I think every specialist in epilepsy has seen what we call post-ictal psychosis. Ictal refers to ictus, which means a seizure. So post-ictal psychosis is the psychosis that follows seizures. So many patients who have seizures, especially those who tend to have seizure clusters or long seizures. Seizure clusters are like one seizure after the other, or long seizures. Some of them, after the seizure stop, will present with psychosis, which can be paranoid psychosis. Somebody in Mars is monitoring me and they want to kill me, or my ex is monitoring me and they're going to kill me. Or it can be not necessarily paranoid. It can be sometimes religious. God is talking to me, and sometimes it's associated with, a very aggressive behavior, and maybe hallucinations, in some individuals. So this may last from hours up to a week, depending on the duration of the seizures and the duration of the seizure clusters. Why does this happen? It's a fascinating area, but it's an area of speculation. We don't really know. But what we know is a parallel phenomenon, another phenomenon that's called Todd's-paresis. So let's say somebody has a seizure that starts from the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. So the left side of the body will show some muscle jerks, repetitive muscle jerks, because the right hemisphere is producing the seizure discharge, right? And then the seizure ends. After the seizure ends, many people will have weakness on the left side of the body, weakness that resembles sometimes a stroke-related weakness, except that it's transient. So the weakness may last from few hours to few days. So one can conclude from this phenomenon that the prolonged seizure discharge resulted in cortical fatigue or in excessive release of inhibitory neurotransmitters in the brain that made that whole hemisphere hypofunction, and that caused weakness on the other side. And until the hemisphere recovers, there will be continued weakness on that side. So is there a similar phenomenon that could be behind psychosis? In other words, if we have centers of the brain that are important for conceptual thinking, that are important for reality assessment, and does the seizure affect the function of these, or the repetitive seizures affect the function of those centers so that it unleashes what we call distorted reality testing, paranoid thinking, all of those psychotic symptoms temporarily? I think this is a plausible hypothesis. But again, where are these centers, and what is the mechanism that results in their diminution of functionality post-ictally after the seizure, continues to be elucidated. Yeah,
that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing all that with us. Dr. Koubeissi, you published a paper in Neurology in 2016. With an incredible finding that is based on a clinical investigation. You had 3 patients of yours. They were undergoing surgical evaluation for a pharmacoresistant epilepsy. Can you share with us what you observed on that particular day?
That was a major surprise to me and my team. So just to give you an introduction, I mentioned when we talked about epilepsy that if somebody has focal epilepsy, we would like to identify with accuracy where seizures are starting from so that we can plan a surgical resection. Some people have normal MRI. There is no scar tissue or any abnormality that the surgeon can target. And if somebody has normal MRI, how can you tell exactly where the seizure focus is? So what we tend to do is we insert needle-like electrodes within the substance of the brain, what we call stereotactically, meaning, through specific computer program and specific, surgical setting, we target specific areas of the brain that we think are the culprits, often the hippocampi, which are responsible for memory, because these are also a very common seizure source, among other areas. And when these electrodes are in the brain, they give us a much better idea about where the seizures could start from, but also they give us an opportunity to map the brain. Mapping means you use the same electrodes to deliver electric pulses to the brain that can interfere with the function of the brain at that specific site. So you can tell whether that specific site where this electrode is or that electrode is important for memory or language or movement or sensation or vision or hearing or any other function. So this was the background of that paper and of many other papers that we published. In those 3 individuals, they had electrodes that were traversing the substance of the brain including an area called the superior longitudinal fasciculus, and of which there is a specific bundle of white matter called the arcuate fasciculus. The arcuate fasciculus is a like you can think of it as a bundle of cables that connect two areas of the brain together. Electric cables, literally. I mean, they are electric cables of sorts, right? That connect two areas of the brain. One of these areas is important for understanding language. We call it receptive language cortex. And the other one is called expressive language cortex, which is important for speech, roughly speaking, and very, to simplify things, right? Obviously, there's much more, complicated mechanisms. Yeah. So these ladies, well, all of them are women, happen to have the electrode in the bundle of white matter that connects different language areas of the brain. And when we stimulated those electrodes electrically, they had a very, very unusual language phenomenon. One of them, for example, the moment we stimulated that particular electrode, she said, "Did I just say a word?" Which was, did I just say "uh-huh"? Or did I just say whiteboard or something? Obviously, she had not said anything. But she had the consistent hallucination of hearing her own voice say something, But she felt that there was something wrong. She wasn't sure that she said it, but she was certain that she said it at the same time, So the fact that in another individual, the stimulation led to hearing a sentence in an Italian-American accent, which is weird. It's weird how that's connected to memory. And she's not of Italian origin herself, but she had heard those things in some mafia movies from the 70s, maybe a Brooklyn accent or something like from the Coppola movies. At any rate, so they had all kinds of weird auditory hallucinations, either of hearing something unusual or of hearing their own voice saying things, which actually, shed lights on potentially the very mechanism of auditory hallucinations, of formed auditory hallucinations. So formed means auditory hallucinations of words that have meaning, because there are auditory hallucinations of sounds that do not make any sense, like just a machine sound, or something like that, like a static. But formed auditory hallucinations, which is what happens in schizophrenia, probably is related to abnormalities in that particular white matter tract, or, the cable bundle that connects language areas. And reviewing the literature when we encountered these examples in our clinical practice, indeed there was a paper that looked at individuals with recently diagnosed, like newly diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they did a form of scan called diffusion tensor imaging, which looks at white matter tracts, and they discovered some abnormalities in that same white matter tract that connects the language areas. Obviously, there's a ton of research that continues to be done, about that. But it's just takes me back to your first question about what made me pursue neurology and epilepsy. It's particularly because they open this vista on how the brain functions. With every single patient that you monitor or that you stimulate electrically, there is a ton of things to learn and about the brain, and it stimulates reviewing the literature and potentially writing up your results and pursuing a new line of clinical research based on that.
Yeah, and the more you learn, the more you realize that there's more to learn.
Totally, of course.
Dr. Koubeissi, I want to quote you from that article. You said, and I quote, "These observations indicate that the awareness of one's motor activity does not solely rely on sensory feedback, but also on a prediction generated before its execution." That's grand. And can our awareness of things be based on a mental construct?
Of course. I mean, to some extent. Think about a very, very simple example about expectation and whether and how it influences your whole experience of reality. So let's say I'm offering you a cup of tea. I'm telling you this is tea. Please have a taste of this tea. And it turns out to be soda or coffee or water or some other drink. The moment you taste it and the moment you discover the discrepancy between your expectation and what this is, it will make you feel even disgusted, right? What kind of tea is this, you know? So, but if you knew from the beginning that it was water or soda, if it matches the expectation. So this is basically a very simple example. Indeed, what we believe takes place with any voluntary action is that it gets planned in the parietal lobe, which is in the back of the brain, especially if it involves like spatial, you know, elements, movement or reaching out or whatever. It gets planned there, and then it gets projected to the motor cortex anteriorly forward to the frontal lobe to be executed. And this is exactly what I meant with what you just quoted, meaning if it's planned in the back, you know, in the back, meaning parietal lobe, then that planning alone may represent a particular awareness of the action itself, even before the action is executed. And
even if you're not planning some motor activity yourself, you're probably thinking of some subject.
Yes, of course.
Outside your body, right? So that creates a fine line between what we call real and what we call mental.
Of course. Totally.
Yeah, that's a whole field of questioning right there. I have thousands to follow up on this one, but I'm going to have to move on, Dr. Koubeissi. People with epilepsy usually experience a loss of consciousness. Your biggest breakthrough in science came in 2014. You published in the scientific journal Elsevier about mapping the center of consciousness in the brain. It was considered one of the top 100 discoveries of the year by the Discovery magazine and put you on National Geographic. Can you please start by defining consciousness and share these findings with us?
The definition of consciousness is not an easy task. Clinicians, they need something that is not conceptual. They need something that is practical. So if you would like to assess whether a specific seizure affects consciousness or not, then you have to test specific things, which include responsiveness and include memory on the top of the list. So if a patient is having a seizure and you go into the patient's room and you tell them, show me 2 fingers with your right hand, and they do, that means they are responsive. And if you tell them, remember the word umbrella, and then after the seizure ends, you tell them what word was that, and they answer umbrella, that means their awareness was likely intact, you know, as far as your bedside assessment, your clinical assessment can tell. So this is very simplistically the clinical assessment of what we call alteration of awareness or lack of alteration of awareness. Just a very quick example. Obviously, there is a big spectrum. But if you look at consciousness from a philosophical point of view, or from, you know, then it may have other connotations, you know, that even not just surpass the bedside assessment, but they surpass the body itself into a global consciousness or you know, universal consciousness or universal mind. So through philosophy, we can go to other areas that are, you know, probably even difficult to define, even more difficult to define.
Yes.
But if we stick to the clinical definition of consciousness, specifically assessed through responsiveness, awareness, and recollection, we had a patient who was being evaluated for medically intractable epilepsy. And she had an electrode in an area of the brain called the claustrum, which is very close to the anterior dorsal insula, by the way, which is unique in humans. the anterior dorsal. It's unique in terms of its size, as we mentioned previously, and it's where you expect to see von Economy neurons, which are also to a large extent unique for humans. So she had an electrode in that area, and when we stimulated that electrode, she had complete arrest of volitional behavior. She was like frozen. When we stopped the stimulation, she immediately returned back, and she had absolutely no idea what happened during the time of the stimulation. We repeated that stimulation many, many times, not just in one session, but over many days. And every time we reached that specific electrode, she would have complete arrest of consciousness. With the eyes open, she maintained her posture in bed. She was still sitting, and she was just staring. And she had absolutely no idea what happened during the stimulation. No memory, no language, no responsiveness, no awareness of time passage. For example, if you told her 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you started the stimulation for 10 seconds, and then stopped the stimulation, and you said 5, 6, 7, she will hear them as consecutive at the same rhythm without any pause. So the time of stimulation is lost. There is complete unawareness of time passage during that period. It's as if it's 0 second that got extended. So this was the finding. The paper had a lot of international visibility because people had written about the colostrum, and it has fascinated many scientists, including Francis Crick, who's a Nobel laureate with Watson for discovering the DNA, of course, the helical structure, the double helix of the DNA. So late in his career, he became very fascinated by consciousness, and he wrote a paper with Christoph Cook from California. In which they hypothesized that the function of the colostrum is to bind together sensory input from various sources. For example, if you have a rose in your hand, you know that the beautiful red color is related to the scent that you're smelling, is related to the thorn that your thumb is feeling, is related to the amount of light and the emotional circumstances at that moment. So everything gets together as a single experience. You don't separate this from that. Christoph gives an example in one of his articles, like if a dog barks, you don't perceive the opening of the dog's mouth and the sound of the bark as separate experiences. You combine them together. So there's something that is taking the input from the auditory cortex and the visual cortex and memory and everything, and combines them together, which they assumed was the colostrum, which is a terrific hypothesis because the colostrum has a lot of connections with all of those brain areas. So when we stimulated the colostrum on the left side and dominant side in that particular patient, and there was this arrest of everything, like inability to assess what's going on, because if a certain input goes to the brain without being associated with context or with other inputs, or if you synchronize the activity in all of that thing in all of those networks artificially, then there will be absolutely no awareness of either potentially the internal environment or the external environment. Wow. So this was the kind of consciousness that was altered in our work, and it was altered by stimulating a specific brain structure. If we're going to talk about other definitions of consciousness, then we will have to, wear the coat of the philosopher, and take off
ages for that. Could the colostrum be the site where memories get altered, since it is the site where there is all this integration, continuous integration with physical stimuli from the physical world mixed with the memory? And we know now that memory gets altered with time. Do you think this is the site where the memory gets changed?
It's difficult to know, but we don't believe so, simply because the colostrum is a very, very thin structure that has only two kinds of cells. So the function that these cells do is likely to be very simple, a very simple task. And the simple task is probably just to bind the experiences together that come from different areas.
Okay.
Memories are formed, through intact hippocampal function, but eventually long-term memory is believed to be stored in the cerebral cortex elsewhere. How it gets changed through time is likely due to what those areas where the memories are stored, what other networks they're being involved in over time, and how those networks may be altering the data. It's very difficult even to speculate about.
Okay, fair. The cerebrum, which is the bulk of the brain you've been talking about, has two halves, right? The two hemispheres you mentioned, the right and the left. Each one of them, although they look alike, they process the information a little bit differently. The right hemisphere is more responsible for our creativity, our imagination, our daydreaming, our holistic thinking, whereas the left brain, the left hemisphere, is more for science and math and physics and analytical and linear thinking. Now, there is a cultural divide between the two methods of inquiry, logic versus creativity, science versus the humanities. Often individuals are proponents of one intellectual activity over the other. Now, just recently in 2020, you earned a master's degree in English literature. And this came after you were a successful neurologist. First, congratulations. And second, what prompted that?
Thank you. So I mentioned to you that in high school, I was fascinated by poetry and mathematics, and mathematics that I pursued in college. I continued to write poetry intermittently and read books intermittently, but at a certain stage, having established, myself as an epileptologist, established my career, those passions get awakened for some reason, for physiological reasons at certain ages. There are things that, that you want to continue, that you had started long time ago. Sure. It's part of the aging of the human brain, but at any rate, I thought that if I enroll in a master's in English literature, I will structure my readings more, I will become more efficient in reading and writing, and I will interact more with people from the humanities, which I thought was necessary. I think interaction between medicine or science in general and the humanities is so essential. I think if one physician or scientist has absolutely no connection with the humanities, it will not serve their career the best. You always need some great idea to lead your work. And those great ideas, they tend to come from philosophy and literature and art in general. So I enrolled in that, and I was very, very pleased to do it at GW, where I met great people, classmates and professors. And I had the opportunity to write my master's thesis on aesthetics, which is something that helped bridge the humanities with neuroscience also.
Yes. Well, to quote Aristotle here, he said, all the better educated and inquiring physicians discuss the philosophy of nature and derive their principles from it. And the most gifted philosophers almost always, in the end, lead up to the principle of medicine, unquote. In your English literature master's thesis, you said, and I'm paraphrasing, if the logical left brain is silenced, then the creative and imaginative right brain is freed. Now, you were looking at individuals with brain lesions and dementias in the left hemisphere and watched their art production getting better and better. In normal situations, in a healthy human being, how easy is it to rewire our brain, to silence the logical, judgmental left brain every once in a while and allow the creative one to be free?
This is what training does, daily training, prolonged training, single-minded training in the arts or in any other field, really. Like when, like the World Cup is now taking place, so we can give an example from football or soccer. When there is a fast ball that is being crossed, and somebody figures that they can do a bicycle kick or some other unusual movement to score, which happened actually in the Brazil match recently. How do they calculate that? They don't. The calculations, the computations that take place between seeing the first movement of the ball coming in their direction, planning the whole action and executing it and scoring. This is something that does not have to do with conceptual thinking at all. This is something that has to do with instinct, with training, with a lot of internal computations that have associations between vision and the motor system and all of this. And our awareness of what happens comes sort of a little late. Everything happens sort of almost spontaneously. Art is similar. People who have trained a lot in the arts, they know how to unleash the artistic part without much inhibitions from the conceptual part and the logical part. They are not afraid to violate logic or to really broaden the horizons and erase borders that have been placed by any rules or any teachings or any inheritance. But it takes time. It takes time. It doesn't. The conscious decision of an artist to simply let go of conceptual thinking and do art is not sufficient. The training that goes into it establishes new synapses in the brain that strengthen the creative parts that probably tend to, hypothetically silence the logical parts or put them away for a second in order for the work of art to manifest itself through the artist.
Practice and hard work, basically. Yes. Now, you mentioned Christoph Koch, chief scientist and president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science. When he was asked one time, how much do we understand of the brain? He said, we don't understand even the brain of a worm. Okay, now the worm he was talking about has 300 neurons. We have 86 billion, and the worm has 7,000 connections. We have 100 trillion connections. Now, knowing how staggering the complexity of the brain is, we claim to be able to resolve this complexity with a reductionist approach, meaning point for point, periodic, linear type of thinking, mathematics and classical physics?
It doesn't seem likely so far.
Okay.
With our knowledge of the workings of the brain, with our computers and their sizes, it doesn't seem likely because the number of synapses of the brain is equal maybe to the number of stars and planets in the universe, and interestingly, the tool that we use to understand the brain is the brain itself. So basically, can the brain understand itself fully? I don't think it's logically impossible, but it doesn't seem likely based on our accomplishments so far. But again, one has to step back and ask what you mean by your question in terms of how do you define understanding the underpinnings of the brain function, fully? What does it mean to know how the brain functions in total? Does it mean identifying each particular network and what activates it and what doesn't activate it, or understanding how a new synapse is formed with training, or understanding, various things? We've done a great job in neuroscience, shedding some light on. But there's something about the brain that differentiates us from machines, which is the brain has innate capacities. I mean, after all, we are mammals, right? We have a specific, need to seek food sources. We have, no matter how affluent the society is, and we have 3 meals a day, we don't have to go through intermittent fasting like our ancestors, but still the food remains a priority. finding the appropriate mate for spreading of genes is a priority. Hatred, territorial things, guilt feeling, shame. I mean, all of these are built in, and all of these shape through affect encoding everything that we do and that we perceive. So this also is consciousness, and this also is workings of the brain, not just conceptual knowledge.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can write to you a 2,000-word description of a specific scent.
Yes.
That some company recently produced, and you will never know what it is unless you smell it.
Exactly.
There's also the sensory experience that gets also intermixed with a number of other factors to give shape to the final experience. So I'm thinking loudly here.
Yeah. Well, there's also creativity and innovation. How do you measure those? How do you measure intuition? How do you measure thought? All these, I don't think so far, I don't think they are algorithmic, but who knows, maybe one day they will be. Scientists believe the brain is deterministic, meaning it succumbs to laws of physics and biology. Since the behavior of the brain is so deterministic, Dr. Koubeissi, how can we claim to be in control of our thoughts?
We may not be. I mean, agency may be a delusion. Maybe. I don't know the answer, the final answer. But what I can tell you is there are a lot of scientific experiments that have concluded that we become aware of our actions or our even intention to do an action only a few seconds after the decision has been made. These are fascinating, experiments that were done in the functional MRI machine or in, with EEG on to look at specific potential that signifies the planning of action, which is called the Bereitschaft potential. So it looks like we become aware of what's going on only after it has the decision or of our actions only after the decision has already been made to do a specific action. So in that case, the agency becomes a very questionable thing, and whether we have it or not. And if we look at this deterministic thing, it doesn't simplify our behavior or our computations, because even if our action is the resultant, the final outcome of many internal unconscious computations, either coming from the memory or from imagination or from the current circumstances that determine our behavior. The number of the input is so enormous that it cannot be, encompassed.
Yeah.
And what is interesting, here's the part that makes it difficult for me to take any side, whether we have agency or we don't have agency, is the training. Like the way we voluntarily decide to train in certain thing, whether it's a spiritual practice, an art practice, a craft, a sport, whatever it is going eventually to influence every action that we do. So this training, which is not a voluntary decision that we take only at the moment of having to take a decision, but it's something that we do on a daily basis, it will influence actions when they, So I think it's both. I mean, there is something that has to do with training, with where you choose to be, with what you choose to do, and with eventually that will eventually become an important factor, one among numerous internal unconscious computations that will determine your behavior.
So in that way, we do have some free will, right?
Probably, but it's not at the time of having to take a decision. If you walk into a lab of a neuroscientist and the neuroscientist will ask you, choose this, or do whatever task, your decision at that moment will be probably deterministic. But if 5 years prior to that experiment, you were doing a specific behavior on a consistent basis, then that background activity that has already resulted in new synapses of your brain and augmenting specific networks and not others will play a role in that specific decision.
Okay. Thank you
So
for
we,
sharing.
we better train ourselves on a daily basis on something interesting that we will find handy in any life situation in the future.
Yes, yes, that's true. Thank you, thank you. Now, the last one, I promise. The human race is on a constant quest to advance knowledge, Dr. Koubeissi, and decode the natural world. We relentlessly seek to control and manipulate our environment in an effort not only to secure our own survival, but sometimes for something trivial, like our own comfort. And yes, the human brain is brilliant. But the irony is that the incredible mess we've created around us, from climate change to mass extinctions, from poverty to wasted resources and wars and all that, all this mess is the product of our intellect. Are we becoming smarter and at the same time less intelligent, less wise?
There's definitely lack of wisdom. Definitely,
Okay.
there is lack of wisdom, in the world today among the powers of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Lack of wisdom because of how limited the action is when it comes to trying to reverse or mitigate the climate change.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely lack of wisdom. There is no lack of intelligence if intelligence is defined in terms of, like, the Western definition of intelligence, the mathematical thinking, the technology, the innovation in those areas. There's something that is very interesting. If you look at what we know about physics and quantum physics today, and you compare it to what we knew 100 or maybe more, maybe 120 years ago, it's unbelievable. If you look at how we live today with smartphones and how we lived just 25 years or 30 years ago without smartphones, it was a completely different kind of life. If you look about mathematics and what kind of open problems we have solved recently that had been unsolved for decades or centuries, it's also fascinating and amazing. But if you look at poetry, or at philosophy, or at spiritual practices, they haven't changed since antiquity. The style of poetry changes, the style of the arts change, but the essence doesn't change. The essence of the art doesn't change. I mean, you can find a poem by Homer and one by Seamus Heaney talking about, a beloved, the essence, or about mourning a family member that died. The essence is not different. The style is different. The essence of spiritual practices is not different between, let's say, Buddha and the current Zen Buddhist monks. Between any historical, spiritual figure, whether from the East or from the Middle East. Middle East being West, by the way, Western religions, the monotheistic religions, and the East, I mean Taoism and Hinduism and Buddhism. They haven't changed. So if we benefit from the experience of people who have been studying the mind itself, through the mind itself for thousands of years, we can become probably our better selves. And we can become probably more compassionate with the planet and with all beings, not just living beings, but even minerals and stones. We will start to see life in them because we are part of this whole thing.
We are, definitely. Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. And I believe that nothing is more dangerous and devastating than a brilliant human being who is not mindful or ethical, right? And who is always locked in a defensive mode, justifying his ill-doing. And so many of those surrounding us today, right? Ruling the world and populations. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Do you have a few minutes for Q&A, or do you rather just wrap it up?
Please, yes, of course.
Okay, please, if you have any questions for Dr. Koubeissi, leave it in the chat box or raise your hand and I will get to you. There is a message to you from Farid Makarim saying, thank you for the wonderful explanation on the brain and the body, but can you explain the connection between brain and the soul? Is it something you want to do?
Socrates likened the brain to, this is actually in the Last Days of Socrates by Plato. I think he likened the brain to a guitar,
okay,
and the mind to the melody. So if you break the guitar, there is no melody, there is no music whatsoever. But again, but the guitar itself is not the melody. It's just an instrument. And I believe this is something that is acceptable even today. So basically, the mind could be a product of many computations that the brain as a tool does. Another example, which comes from Fritjof Capra in a book called the Tao of Physics, is you see the brain or the mind or the soul, whatever you want to call it, may be the ultimate combination of things in the brain. The example he gives is if you consume oxygen alone or carbon alone or hydrogen alone, you won't experience sweetness. But if they are combined together in the structure of the molecule sucrose or glucose, and you taste it, then you will experience sweetness. So that the sweetness is not a function of the components, it's a function of the whole, and the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This could potentially be an answer, but it's not my final answer. There's something that is beyond that it's probably beyond the scope of this interview.
Yes. Thank you for answering it anyways. And thank you for the question, Farid. I have one for you coming from Jean Salty. Go ahead, Jean.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Koubeissi, for the wonderful presentation. It has been so enlightening. I'm speaking from Africa, Malawi. And thank you so much, Dr. Robina, for hosting this presentation. It's so eye-opening. My question is, I have been listening from Dr. Caroline Leaf on her findings about rewiring of the brain with the research from the people who are considered as would be garbage, but with positive thinking, she indicates that there has been a reversal of the situation. They have become normal. I just wanted to find out from you, Dr. Koubeissi, to what extent can a person who is passing through or experiencing some brain tremors or seizures, if they engage positive thinking, or which would lead to rewiring, to what extent is that? Can that be? Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. I think the rewiring of the brain. So one thing we know for sure about the ability of the brain to rewire, which is in neuroscience books is referred to as brain plasticity. How plastic the brain is, meaning how malleable the brain is changes with age. In children, it's more than adults, way more than adults. That's how children learn language very quickly, but after the age of 15 or 18, it becomes much more difficult to learn a language, and we continue to have an accent, as I illustrated today. So it changes with age. That's one thing. The other thing is, if you really want to rewire the brain at a later age, let's say somebody who has a stroke or seizure at the age of 50 and they want to rewire the brain, it will take a very, very, very long time, and the results may not be perfect because there's already an area of the brain that is injured, and it will continue to irritate and do that, the pathological process. That said, there is a recent study from Patrick Kwan from Australia that found that individuals with epilepsy who engage in mindful thinking, mindful meditation practice will have less seizures. Again, this is a very short-term study, 6 weeks. We don't know if the reduction of seizures and the improvement of the quality of life, it's probably not related to rewiring as much as to improvement of stress handling, because also increased stress can increase seizures. So to summarize, it is age-related, and it takes long. Think of the athletes who are number one in the world. Think of the pianists who are number one of the world, and see how long it took them to get to that stage.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you so much. And the second question is about I have a passion in mentoring the youth. And when we are talking about fostering change among the youth, we are talking about dealing with brain. And to what extent can we go in terms of, fostering this change, bringing about the message of change, transforming the mindsets of the youth, or is it age-based? I just wanted to learn from you, Dr. Koubeissi.
Well, it's multifactorial. Age-based is something that is well known, but also, youths are prone to peer pressure, to environmental things, they do imbibe things around, like from the world, from their own homes or own teachers, and from the whole world in a very unconscious, some are conscious and others are unconscious fashion that determine behaviors and engagements and preferences. When I think about youth these days, especially here in the United States, I think about the addiction to electronics and the phones, and how we can alter that, and how we can, give books and art and sports, some place in their lives again. This is what we care about. But again, if you're able to induce a trend among peers that will influence other peers, you may be able to start something like a domino effect down the road. But things will manifest the way they want to manifest, no matter what we do sometimes.
Thank you, Jean. There is one, if you can answer it pretty quickly, from Rafiq Muhtar. He's saying thank you. And his question is in regards to dementia. What can one do through diet, brain exercises, etc., to prevent or slow down the onset of dementia?
There are studies that brain exercises, cognitive exercises, whether it's memory, attention, and even eye-hand coordination, among others, that they can slow down the rate of decline in dementia, even better than some of the medications that have been approved for, let's say, Alzheimer's disease. Like there's a medication called Aricept and similar medications that have been used to improve the memory of individuals with Alzheimer's disease. But I think the practice, practicing cognitive exercises can be at least as beneficial, if not better. It is very important for those who have an individual with dementia in their family to allow them to express themselves. There are many studies about poetry writing or painting. This is new onset passion for art in older individuals with dementias that have shown creativity and that have shown improved quality of life and improved cognition with these engagements. Social stimulation is also crucial. An individual with dementia who is left sort of neglected, they will decline much faster.
Thank you for answering that question. Dr. Koubeissi, you have a history with Studio Fan. Just briefly, can you share it with our audience?
Yes, I was 20 actually. I was still studying mathematics undergrad at AUB, and I participated. That was 1992. 92, 93. I participated representing Beirut in Studio Fan for poetry.
Yes.
So I read some poems and I eventually qualified to the finals. And in the finals, you had to write a poem on a specific subject that they gave you while you're there in the studio.
Oh, wow.
In the theater, yeah. So I wrote whatever, they gave me a subject and I wrote a poem. And then in the finals, we did the same. And eventually I got a gold medal.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
You shared with me a small verse in Arabic. كلمة سائب نمرق بخاطر بعض.
Yes.
Should I continue? بنفس الدقيقة تنسمع بالكون موسيقى وبتضل تبرم هالأرض. To translate, and hopefully I can capture the essence of it, you're saying every moment we happen to cross each other's minds, music would engulf the universe, and the planets continue to move in orbit. This is
Beautiful
beautiful.
translation.
You're
Thank you.
connecting love to music, to the works of the cosmos in a circle.
Yes, everything works by waves.
Yes.
From electromagnetism to sound to even the workings of the actual subatomic particles. So that maybe, I don't know the background of the analogy, but yes, and this is one example whereby consciousness sort of exists outside of the border of our skin in the world itself. Poetry makes it easier to understand than science.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Koubeissi, for coming on the show, first of all, and for your patience. You were here for an hour and a half almost, and all these questions that you answered so generously. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to say before I wrap it up?
I'd like to thank you, Lubna. I really enjoyed this, and I'm delighted to be part of this series. And thank you very much, because the questions that you gave me revived a lot of lines of research in my mind and a lot of writings that I need to do. And it's just a huge bout of positive energy. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel the same. Thank you so much. And keep up the good work. Today's event will be uploaded to my YouTube channel, where you can watch it and share it openly. Unheard Stories is a monthly event. It falls on the last Saturday of every month. I will be taking a break in the month of December, and I will resume again in January. I wish you all a restful end of year and happy holidays to all of you, and have a fantastic 2023. Goodbye for now. Bye-bye, Dr. Koubeissi.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.